At my wife's celebration of life, my nephew handed me a legal envelope. He leaned in close so no one else could hear him and whispered, "You have 10 days to get out of the cottage. It's mine now." Then he straightened up, nodded politely to a guest behind me, and walked away, as if he had just told me what time the meeting was tomorrow. I stood there in my black suit, still numb from burying my wife that same morning, watching him disappear into the crowd with that familiar smirk I had seen too many times before. 10 days. 10 days to leave the place my grandparents had built in 1952 with their own hands. The place where my wife and I had spent every summer of our marriage, where we raised our daughter, where our family history lived in every wooden beam and faded photograph. I didn't open the envelope right away. The room was full of people talking about Linda, about her 28 years teaching grade 3, about her volunteer work at the hospital, about her laugh that somehow always filled a room even when she spoke softly. My daughter Emma was across the hall accepting condolences, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her hands shaking slightly as she hugged people. This was not the moment to read legal threats. This was not the moment to let anger or fear take over. So I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket and went back to thanking people for coming, shaking hands, listening to stories, and accepting casseroles I knew I would never eat. That night, after the house had gone quiet and Emma had gone back to Ottawa, I finally sat alone at my kitchen table and opened the envelope. Inside were several neatly organized documents: an eviction notice, a legal claim to the cottage, and a will I had never seen before, supposedly signed by my grandmother in 2008, leaving the cottage to my nephew. I read the pages once, then again, then a third time. Each time, something cold settled deeper in my chest. My grandmother had died in 2006. She had been in a nursing home with advanced dementia for years before that. She could barely recognize her own children by the end. There was no possible way she could have signed a legal will in 2008. What made it worse was that I knew what her real will said. I had been there when it was read. I remembered sitting in a lawyer's office years ago listening as my grandmother left me the cottage, the small fishing boat, and a modest savings account. She did it because I was the one who visited her every week, who brought her flowers, who sat with her when she no longer knew who I was. My nephew had visited her twice in those final years, once to ask for money and once to ask for more. I felt many things in that moment, but strangely, anger was not the first. What I felt was a kind of stillness, a quiet warning inside me that said, "Stop, think, don't react, not yet." This was not just about property, this was about something much deeper. Someone was trying to rewrite my family's history while we were grieving, hoping we were too broken to notice. I called my daughter Emma the next morning. She answered tired, her voice still heavy with grief, but clear the moment I explained what had happened. There was a long pause on the line when I finished. Then she said quietly, "Dad, tell me you're not just going to accept this." I told her I wasn't. She gave me the name of a lawyer in Toronto who specialized in estate fraud and told me to call her immediately. By that afternoon, I was sitting in a glass-walled office downtown, watching a woman named Patricia Chen examine the documents my nephew had given me. She didn't need long. After a few minutes, she looked up and said, "This is fake." Not carelessly or casually, but with the calm certainty of someone who had seen this kind of thing before. She pointed out tiny details I never would have noticed: hesitation marks in the signature, inconsistencies in the formatting, a notary stamp that didn't match the era. "Someone tried very hard to make this look real," she said, "but they tried too hard." As I left her office that day, the shock of what had happened finally began to transform into something else, something steadier and stronger. Grief was still there. I still missed my wife with an ache I couldn't explain. But now there was also clarity. Someone had tried to take advantage of our loss. Someone had underestimated how much this place, this family, and this history meant to us. And I knew with complete certainty that I was not going to let that happen. Once the first shock faded, everything became very focused and very practical. Patricia Chen explained what we needed to do next, and she did it without drama or false reassurance. We would have to prove that the will was forged, that my grandmother was mentally incapable of signing anything in 2008, and that my nephew had acted knowingly and intentionally. None of that would be quick, and none of it would be easy, but it was possible. That alone was enough to give me a strange sense of calm. There was a path forward, and that mattered more than anything. The first thing Patricia asked for was the original will. I kept it in a safety deposit box at the bank, untouched since the day my grandmother died. When I brought it to her office, she compared it side by side with the fake one my nephew had produced. The differences were subtle, but undeniable. The language in the real will was precise and old-fashioned, written by a careful lawyer who had done this for decades. The fake one was close, but not quite right. The phrasing was slightly modern, the punctuation inconsistent, the paper newer than it should have been. It looked correct at a glance, which was exactly what the person who created it had intended. We also requested my grandmother's medical records from the nursing home. They showed clearly and painfully what we already knew in our hearts. By 2008, she was not capable of understanding legal documents, much less signing them. She was often confused about where she was, sometimes about who she was, and needed help with nearly everything. Seeing it written in clinical language made it more real somehow, and more heartbreaking. But it also made the truth impossible to ignore. A few days later, I drove up to the cottage. It was early November, the trees bare, the lake gray and restless under a heavy sky. I had a key, but when I arrived, the locks had been changed. New, shiny deadbolts on the door. A sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." My nephew's truck was parked behind the house. I stood on the porch my grandfather had built and looked through the window at the living room where my wife and I had celebrated decades of anniversaries, and something inside me hardened. Not with hatred, but with resolve. I took photos of everything, the locks, the sign, the truck, then turned around and left. That night, sitting alone in a coffee shop in Bracebridge, I started researching my nephew's company, Sterling Development. On the surface, it looked impressive. Glossy photos, luxury homes, smiling clients. But when I looked closer, a pattern began to appear. Every property they listed used to be an old family cottage. Every single one had been demolished and replaced with something massive and expensive. I pulled up maps, traced locations, compared timelines. It was too consistent to be coincidence. Over the next week, I drove around the lake and spoke to people. At first, most were cautious. No one likes to revisit painful things. But when I explained why I was asking, many opened up. They told me about elderly relatives who had been confused, about documents that appeared suddenly after funerals, about cottages that vanished before families could even understand what had happened. At one house, a woman named Dorothy invited me in for tea and told me about the Morrison family cottage next door, how it had been in their family for 5 generations before her neighbor's grandson somehow ended up with it and tore it down. The name she gave me was my nephew's. When I returned to Toronto, Patricia had more news. My nephew was under financial pressure. He had gambling debts, large ones. He was desperate for cash, and the cottage property was worth over $1 million. Suddenly, his actions made sense. He hadn't just targeted me because I was vulnerable. He had targeted me because I was convenient. Patricia hired a private investigator, a former RCMP officer, to begin monitoring him. It didn't take long for him to confirm what we suspected. My nephew was already meeting with investors, showing them development plans for my cottage property, promising construction would start soon. He was selling something that wasn't his to sell. At that point, the case stopped being just personal. It became something larger. This wasn't a family dispute. It was a pattern of exploitation, a business model built on grief, confusion, and trust. We filed an emergency motion to freeze any transactions involving the cottage. The judge granted it quickly. My nephew could not sell, transfer, or develop the property. That decision alone collapsed several of his deals. His investors wanted their money back. His cash flow stopped overnight. That was when he called me. For the first time since the celebration of life, I heard his voice again. It was polite, overly friendly, and strained. He spoke of misunderstandings and mistakes, of finding a compromise, of keeping things within the family. I listened quietly, then told him after the property freeze was granted, everything accelerated. What had been slow and methodical suddenly became urgent and exposed. My nephew's carefully built image began to crack. His investors were calling him. His lawyers were calling him. People who had once treated him like a rising star in the development world were now treating him like a liability. And for the first time since this started, he wasn't ahead of us anymore. He was reacting. The private investigator kept us updated. My nephew was meeting with people late at night in hotel lounges and empty offices, trying to reassure them, trying to hold things together. He was still insisting the property was his, still promising that construction would begin soon, still acting as if the court order didn't exist. But behind the scenes, his world was shrinking fast. He had built his business on speed and confidence, on moving faster than questions could be asked. Now that questions were being asked, he didn't know how to slow down enough to answer them. The Ontario Provincial Police officially opened an investigation. Detective Sarah Marshall was assigned to the case. She listened carefully as we walked her through everything: the forged will, the medical records, the dead notary, the pattern of property transfers, the families who had been affected. She didn't interrupt much. She asked precise questions, wrote things down, and occasionally made a phone call to confirm something in real time. When we left her office that day, she told us simply, "This is serious, and it's not going away." Over the next several weeks, Detective Marshall and her team worked quietly but thoroughly. They pulled financial records, traced email accounts, subpoenaed contracts, and interviewed witnesses. They found the notary listed on the fake will had died before the document was supposedly signed. They found inconsistencies in bank transfers connected to my nephew's business. They found investors who had paid deposits on developments that didn't legally exist yet. Each new discovery didn't just confirm what we suspected, it widened the scope of the case. My nephew's lawyer contacted Patricia with an offer. If we dropped the fraud complaint and stopped cooperating with the police, my nephew would give up his claim to the cottage and walk away. It was presented as a generous compromise, a way to avoid unnecessary damage on both sides. Patricia's response was short and precise. "Your client committed crimes. This is no longer a negotiation." That was the moment I fully understood that what we were doing wasn't just for ourselves. If we accepted the cottage back quietly and let everything else disappear, he would do this again. Maybe not to us, but to someone else. Someone older, someone more confused, someone without a daughter who knew the law. A few days later, he was arrested. It happened early in the morning. The police went to his home and took him in without spectacle, without drama. No handcuffs in public, no cameras. Just a quiet ending to a long string of deceptions. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, theft, and wire fraud. And that was just related to our case. More charges were expected. When Detective Marshall called me to tell me, I thanked her and hung up. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was a strange, heavy relief, like something toxic had finally been removed from the air. The legal process moved forward steadily after that. Evidence was organized, Witnesses were prepared, experts were consulted. My daughter took a leave from her work to assist the prosecution, helping them present the case clearly and carefully. She was calm and precise, and I was proud of her in ways I didn't have words for. The trial lasted 8 months. I attended every day. I watched my nephew sit at the defense table, no longer confident, no longer smooth, just a man surrounded by the consequences of his choices. His lawyer tried to frame it as confusion, as misunderstanding, as a family dispute that had grown out of proportion. But the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too documented to be explained away. Experts testified about signature forgery, about how fake documents are created, about how elderly people with dementia are often targeted because they cannot defend themselves. Doctors testified about my grandmother's condition, about her inability to understand legal agreements. Families testified about their cottages, their losses, their confusion, their regret at not acting sooner. My daughter stood and walked the jury through the timeline step by step. She showed them how the pattern repeated itself, how each case looked slightly different on the surface, but was identical underneath. Same methods, same timing, same outcome. When the jury retired to deliberate, I sat in the hallway and waited. 4 hours later, they returned. Guilty on all counts. My nephew was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. His company was dissolved, H. When the trial ended and the paperwork was finalized, I drove back up to the cottage alone. It was early summer again. The lake was calm, the air warm, and everything looked exactly the way it always had. The same trees, the same dock, the same old screen door that never quite closed properly. I unlocked the door with my original key, the one I had carried since I was 16, and stepped inside. The rooms felt both familiar and different. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The couch where Linda and I used to sit in the evenings, the bookshelf filled with old paperbacks, the table where we played cards on rainy days. They were all still there. But now they felt quieter, as if they were waiting. Not empty, exactly, but unfinished. As if the cottage itself was asking what would happen next. I sat on the porch for a long time that first evening and listened to the water. I thought about what the cottage had been and what it had survived. It had survived time, weather, generations, and now greed. It had been built with care, maintained with patience, and almost destroyed by someone who saw only its financial value. That contrast stayed with me. That was when the idea came, not all at once, but slowly and gently. The cottage did not need to belong to me alone anymore. It could belong to something larger than my own family. It could become a place of rest for people who desperately needed rest. A place away from hospitals, appointments, and waiting rooms. A place where families could simply be together. I called my daughter Emma and told her what I was thinking. I expected questions, maybe hesitation. Instead, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom would have loved that." And I knew immediately that she was right. We began the process carefully. We worked with the local hospital foundation. We registered a nonprofit organization. We created guidelines, schedules, and simple rules to make sure families could come without stress or cost. It took time. It took paperwork, meetings, and patience. But every step felt purposeful. We named it the Linda Margaret Thompson Cottage. The first family arrived in June. A father with stage 4 lymphoma. A mother who looked exhausted in a way only long fear can create. 3 children who were trying very hard to be brave. I showed them around the cottage, the dock, the boat, the old board games in the closet. I taught the kids how to fish off the dock, the same way I had taught my daughter decades earlier. I watched them explore the place, slowly relaxing, slowly remembering how to laugh. In the evenings, the parents sat on the porch and talked quietly while the kids played. No beeping machines, no hospital smells, no constant reminders of what they were afraid of. just water, wind, and time together. On their last day, the mother found me alone on the porch. She thanked me. I asked her what the cottage had meant to them. She said, "You gave us time that didn't feel borrowed." That stayed with me. More families came after that, each one different, each one carrying its own story, its own weight, its own hope. Some stayed a week, some stayed longer, some returned. Some sent letters months later telling me how much that quiet time had mattered. The cottage changed again, but this time in a good way. It filled with life, laughter, quiet conversations, and healing moments. It became something living instead of something preserved. And somehow, through that change, it felt more like home than ever. I thought about my nephew less and less. He had seen the cottage as land. I had seen it as memory. Now it had become meaning. It was no longer just a place from the past. It was a place for the present and for the future.